Okay, so we have spent the day talking about various themes related to Canada's inclusive growth and strategic competitiveness. And the elephant in the room is we've actually just emerged very recently from a crisis, a health crisis related to the pandemic. And I want to start by thanking the three of you because you led through the pandemic, you continue to lead to bolster Canada's health security. And so thank you for your leadership. And then I'll get to the thorny questions. So in the pandemic, Canada fared fairly well as compared to our global counterparts. We gained access to vaccines and we had high vaccination rates. However, we leveraged our capital, we leveraged our friends, our allies in order to secure the vaccines and to ensure that Canadians had access. Other countries, like the UK, were able to ramp up their biomanufacturing capabilities and vaccine development. Israel leveraged their data to gain preferential access to the Pfizer vaccine early on. And Canada luckily had friends and allies, had the capital to spend, but didn't really have tradables to share at global negotiating tables in the same way. And so now, here we are, over a year later, out of the crisis, and I think Canadians are wondering, if this happens again, how ready are we? Are we ready for the next pandemic? And where are our gaps?
Well, maybe I'll start
Sure.
first and say, as you've mentioned, we're coming out, but I'd be remiss if I didn't thank all of the healthcare workers on the front line, government, who worked very, very closely during that pandemic. And in particular here in Canada, especially with Johnson & Johnson and Janssen being active with vaccines, we found a tremendous amount of flexibility and adaptability and willingness to do what it takes to provide Canada with what they needed, even in absence of some of those tradables that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's a strength that needs to be leveraged, not just during time of crisis, so that open communication, the trust that we found on a daily basis that enabled us to talk freely, to overcome obstacles, that is something we need to continue throughout and make that as part of the norm in absence of a pandemic, because then, as we're doing that as the normal course of business, mm-hmm. we'll be much more prepared when the next pandemic comes. The second piece that I would say, as you ask about some of the gaps, one would be the true end-to-end integration of supply chains and the healthcare system, and I'll call it the healthcare chain. There are great areas that Canada has as part of healthcare, but I would say when you think about the total ecosystem, to have good, strong manufacturing, robust in many, many different areas, in particular for innovative medicines, mm-hmm. is an area of opportunity. I think also, too, lastly, I would say is building on the great strength of the open borders and free trade that we experienced with Canada that helped Johnson & Johnson, not just our two countries, but literally those around the globe. And that is a strength that I think can be leveraged even more so on an ongoing basis.
Simon, I'll let you chime in here because I know we have a very strong biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy at the federal level. You've been leading, of course, the execution of that strategy by deploying a strategic innovation fund towards life sciences companies. How are we getting ready for the next pandemic?
Well, I think we've come a long way in the last 3 years or so. I think the government, you might expect me to say it, but I think the government deserves credit for, making this a priority. There's been a lot of capital that's been allocated, public funds, mm-hmm. to support the strategy. There's an official strategy that, you can go on the website and see it. There is a committee of very senior officials in Ottawa that meet regularly to take stock and to kind of make decisions to advance the strategy. If you look at where we were at the outset of the pandemic, we have this storied legacy as a country in the biomanufacturing and life science space, Connaught Labs and insulin and polio and there's been we have a huge competency and expertise at the kind of preclinical level and university researchers and a lot of prominent scientists, a lot of Canadians that are well known and frankly have trained a lot of the management teams in some of these international companies. It was really instructive to me, actually, when we were on the hunt for vaccines, that we could talk to Canadians at top universities and scientists, Order of Canada recipients. Oh yeah, that guy used to be my graduate student, you know, who's now like running one of the big corporations. So we were able to leverage this kind of legacy that we had of expertise in this space. But truthfully, a lot of, not all of it, we have some great companies here, but a lot of the at-scale manufacturing capacity had, you know, over time, over many years, it was a secular trend, had really left. And so when the pandemic hit, and I don't know, you know, I'm certainly not expert in the way my colleagues are in the industry per se, but the manufacture of these kinds of therapeutics, it's a supply chain. There are different players at different parts of the supply chain. It isn't like one company doing it all in a vertically integrated manner. In fact, you know, one of the leading vaccines, the drug substance was made in one country. It was then shipped to another country to be, you know, filled and put in the fill and finish, the vials, and then it was shipped to another country to be packaged. By the time you get the thing, it's like any other advanced product. It's gone through a lot of hands. So there's this complicated supply chain. We were really good at the front end of the research, great people in our universities, but in the other big choke points in the supply chain, a lot of that had really eroded to a point where we just didn't have the capability. So when we went around and talked to people and said, you know, we'd like to tech transfer that vaccine and make it in Canada, we have some of these facilities. Unfortunately, in the middle of a crisis, you know, to be able to spare the time and energy, if you're a company that makes vaccines, to put something into a Canadian facility where maybe you make 10 million doses, you can't do that. You got to go to the countries that can make 200 million and 300 million doses, and frankly, whose equipment is state of the art and kind of much more modern. So this was a real wake-up call, and what you know, Ottawa did, and what we did in concert with the industry and with really great advice from our top scientists and industrialists. We had a task force on vaccines, we had a task force on therapeutics, is we mapped the whole supply chain and said, okay, if we want to be able to make therapeutics, vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, you know, in a crisis, what are the areas where we're weak? You know, we actually had a map, you know, red, yellow, this kind of stuff. And there's been a very systematic effort with, I think at this point, maybe $3 billion of government capital in partnership with companies to go in and kind of turn the reds into greens all along that supply chain. So, you know, one factoid, fill and finish is an important part of the vaccine process. You know, you can make the bulk substance, it's in a big vat, I guess. You know, it's got to be put in these little aseptic vials. That's a specialized process, and there are companies that do nothing but that. And we have invested in several to dramatically scale up the ability to actually take the bulk substance and get it into that final finished product. We didn't have that kind of capability at scale. Now that's rapidly turning into green. And we're doing that at all the kind of key choke points. So I actually think we're in a much better place than we were a few years ago. I'll kind of stop there. What I would say is that I think the challenge for governments, not just our government, but into the future, and the challenge for policymakers, and one a lot of people are thinking about, is how do you keep the edge of the blade sharp in peacetime when you don't have a crisis kind of breathing down your neck? Because a lot of this capacity may or may not be fully economic to have in a country like Canada. You may or may not need the kind of firepower you need in an emergency. So like, how do you keep, you know, it's like, how do you keep people ready? And, you know, and there's been a lot of really interesting discussion. And I think that's the next phase of our strategy is, now that we're well on our way to kind of rebuilding and there's this renaissance, how do we kind of keep the party going when, you know, things kind of go back to normal?
I think that's an excellent point, and many people say, you know, we're back to normal. And yet when you look at where there's a defined set of pathogens that we all know could pose a set of future health threats. The WHO has been very transparent about that. One of them actually, Dom, you work on, and this idea of Bright Angel Therapeutics, which is preclinical. So we're talking now back to, Simon, your point on our expertise in the science and our deep scientific expertise. It's true, you're headquartered in Toronto, Ontario, and you're working on antimicrobial resistant technologies. Can you talk about, you know, what does that threat look like, and are we ready for that different kind of threat, given that you're in that kind of early science stage?
Yeah, certainly, I'd love to. So I think with AMR, so antimicrobial resistance, you know, the world is not ready. According to a 2018 paper by the Canadian, or the Council of Canadian Academies, reported that 27% of infections were resistant to drugs commonly used to treat that infection, and that number is expected to increase to 40% by 2050, leading to 390 96,000 Canadian deaths, and a cost of $126 billion to the Canadian healthcare system. So I think, look, we're not ready. The world's not ready. So we need to invest in developing drugs to treat potential antibacterial infections, as well as fungal infections that we just don't have the treatments to combat at the present time.
And I think going back to something, Simon, you speak about, I know often, this idea of end-to-end and what that means, and can you be end-to-end? I know, Courtney, your expertise, of course, is in supply chain. So we've been talking a lot today about Canada. Where does Canada uniquely fit? Critical minerals is a natural asset that we have. You know, what is unique about Canada in that supply chain?
So I do think that Canada can take advantage of many of the natural resources that you have. And that's an opportunity for you to, as part of the strategy that Simon mentioned, for you to make choiceful picks that you're going to stay with over time, that will be developed and supported during peak times as well as during the valleys. And that's where we find, I'll call it, the countries that we partner with, build our global supply chains to support hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of doses that we produce in these plants. They have to be supported during good times and bad. And the countries that do that well, we find the repetitive nature to bring new products into those sites. The investments that we do to upgrade and make sure that the next wave of technology, that if not focused on and not viewed as a strategic investment, that site becomes obsolete, and unfortunately the people in it as well, because the workforce development processes and the upskilling that's required doesn't occur. So countries that focus on the full end-to-end ecosystem, and I'm super encouraged to hear what Simon has said that's being done here. It makes a company like ours and other colleagues in multinational corporations in the space that we're in, I would say they're equally excited to hear about that. But we need global supply chains, not any one country. I think you're going to make a mistake if you feel like you're going to be able to do every aspect of a supply chain, let's say, for vaccines. You're going to wind up 20 years from now, 30 years from now saying, wow, we closed the plant in wherever you decided to invest. And so it's choices, and it's building strong partnerships with allies that you know will be there for you during those tough times.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because I know, Simon, you said there is this risk that urgency is lost, that pressure is lost over time as people become sort of more apathetic about the pandemic. So how do we continue that investment on an ongoing basis, and what kinds of examples or partnerships might we point to that are effective in maintaining that momentum?
Well, maybe if I could just comment, Courtney, on your comment, and then I'll go to the. So completely agree that it's probably unrealistic, especially for a country like Canada. We have substantial capability, but we're 40 million people. To imagine that we can build an end-to-end solution for every single possible conceivable threat. But I think the point being that we need to have substantial capabilities, and there may be places or certain kinds of technologies where actually we want to have at least some measure of most of it in-house. But those are going to be judgment calls. Maybe the next crisis, actually, it turns out, we made the wrong bet. But I think, for example, mRNA seems like a really important kind of platform technology. It may not be a good idea to have no capability to manufacture or no expertise in that space. But if we have substantial trading cards in an emergency, that actually makes it easier to be part of a supply chain. But if you come to a supply chain and they say, well, what can you do? And you say, well, we can't do anything. Makes it a lot more difficult to have the conversation. But if you can say, well, we have a substantial ability to do fill and finish, or, in the case of a vaccine, or actually, we have the scalability to make lipid nanoparticles or something. I don't know what it would be. And you saw some of that actually in the pandemic, where there were certain kinds of commodities like masks and so on, or ventilators, where actually we had real capability, which actually was of interest to allies, and the trade was able to keep flowing because actually we brought something to the table. So it sounds a bit mercenary, but I think the key is not necessarily to imagine we can do everything in-house, but we need to make judgments about what are some of the things we really want to do in-house. It's actually really important to have some of that capability domestically, but knowing we can't do everything, make those judgments wisely, and have enough capability that you're actually a serious interlocutor in a crisis, where you're at a table and you can actually help fill in gaps that somebody else might have, and maybe they can fill in some of yours. But if you show up empty-handed, that's a much more difficult discussion. I think the issue of how do we keep a level of readiness, and how do we ensure that all the progress in the last couple of years is sustained? I mean, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this very issue. I think some of it is, these are decisions governments are going to have to take. I'm just an official sort of, bringing options forward. But certainly some countries have chosen to put certain kinds of institutional arrangements in place to make sure that there's kind of constant readiness. I mean, the most vivid example of this is the United States with BARDA. After a number of crises, the U.S. government said, you know what, actually, we need a dedicated agency, and all they do night and day is think about getting ready against biological threats to Americans. And actually, we talk to BARDA all the time, and indeed, there are people, and that's all they do is think about this, and they have a budget to kind of invest for this. So there are institutional things you can do. One thing that was brought to my attention actually by one of the kind of key advisors in this space, there's a really interesting speech that I think Tony Blair gave recently, but it was a whole discussion. Tony Blair, the former prime minister, has this institute, and they talk about these kinds of issues. And it was on this very question of like, how do you keep readiness going? And part of the thinking was, we need to not be thinking about this as a capability that is at rest, waiting for the next emergency. Like, if you really want to keep the edge of your knife sharp, you have to be using it regularly. So we got to be thinking about, I guess the expression would be, it has to always be on. This was kind of the thinking. And how are you always on? Well, if you look at mRNA, for example, the first big application of that was, Moderna and Pfizer and so on. It was a COVID vaccine, but it was actually developed for other kinds of illnesses, cancer and so on. And we may be able to keep the mRNA platform sharp and at the cutting edge and be learning more about the power of that technology in peacetime by actually pouring money in and focusing on that capability, but not necessarily to only be doing pandemic readiness, actually be worried about how do you cure cancers and how do you make adult vaccines for other kinds of things. So I think we've got to think strategically about making sure that our support for the biomanufacturing industry is doing things that are relevant in the here and now, but actually have a big dividend for when the next emergency strikes. Somebody had told me, I don't know if it's true, it sounds like it's true, but like you look at the Red Cross, for example. I mean, the Red Cross are often going to disaster zones around the world, and the result of this is that when there's a disaster at home, it isn't like the last disaster at home was years ago. It's like they have a tempo where they're regularly doing stuff, and so when there's something hits, they're kind of ready to go. What's the equivalent of that sort of thing in biomanufacturing, where the companies and the technology we're supporting is being used in the here and now, but actually we're being strategic about what we do so that in the future, when crisis strikes, that capability is there and it's ready to go. And I think I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I think conceptually that's a really interesting concept.
It's interesting. So we just launched Life Sciences Forum in partnership with many of you at the Public Policy Forum. And one of the things that came out really early was this idea that we think about healthcare as a cost. We don't think about it the way that we think about our physical security or our economic security. We think of it as a cost in the system. And I think what you're saying, Simon, is so poignant because it's really about health security, the security lens, and maintaining the momentum and thinking about the sector in that way and the continuous investment in the sector in that way. You've talked about mRNA. Can we talk about AMR? Because I know we all go to mRNA a little bit naturally because we just lived it. What's happening in the AMR space? What does that kind of investment look like? When Simon and Courtney talk about these cross-cutting areas, is there a gap there? Are we investing in that space?
So we need more public investment in the AMR space. Actually, today in the Wall Street Journal's front page was basically that Congress has reintroduced the Pasteur Act. So the problem with developing antibacterial drugs is there's not a big market for it. And if there's not a big market for it, investors don't want to invest in companies generating new solutions. So it's a market problem. So with the introduction of the Pasteur Act, hopefully it's being reintroduced into Congress, that will provide a market for antibacterial drugs so they can be kept on the shelf and be used in the, in the incidence of an emergency. So I think that's progress, but we need, more investment into the development of antibacterials as well as antifungals. There's push incentives we need to try to drive the technology development forward, and then we need pull incentives to, help make the investment case for venture capitalists to come in and fund the development of a drug. Because it takes a long time. It can take between 10 and 20 years to develop a new drug. And, we don't have the drugs right now, so we're looking at 10 to 20 years for treatments for these various infections. So it's an urgent need, and I think the manufacturing strategy is great. We're lucky that the messenger RNA technology was at the ready for us, and we need to kind of bring along these other technologies. So, when the next pandemic happens or when the next drug-resistant bug happens, we're ready to treat it.
So Courtney, I want to bring in your global perspective here, because you work across North America, you've worked in other places in the world, and I read this stat that Johnson & Johnson sells over 400,000 products to 1.2 billion patients and consumers.
A day.
That's
A day.
That is staggering.
Yes.
So when you look at the Canadian market in the context of all of that, what is unique? Why are you Johnson & Johnson investing in Canada specifically?
Well, it's because of many of the things that Simon's mentioned that's happening within the government. The good thing is we've been in Canada for more than 100 years, Johnson & Johnson. We have a plant in Guelph, which we just did a significant investment with partnership from government, right? So having an environment that supports global manufacturing organizations like ours is super important. As we were thinking about, and there were a few countries and locations that we were considering for our global investment, and it was for Tylenol, right? We wanted to make sure that we didn't have shortages during times like this. And like I said, many of the things that Canada is doing, they help to encourage us. I talked about the free flow of goods, both in and out of Canada throughout the pandemic. Canada was the best practice, literally one of the best around the globe for Johnson & Johnson to help us ensure that those 1.2 billion a day would continue to flow. So the partnership with regulatory agencies, things of that nature, those are positive. But like I said, we've got to continue to have that throughout. The last point I'll make is because we focus predominantly on innovative medicines. So innovation is critical. And one of our factors that we look at when we think about these global investments is how much also, too, the country focuses on the next wave of innovation. And also making that next wave of innovation available to their patients, consumers within their country. Because when we can see that happens and that total ecosystem exists, then you know that it's going to be there over time.
So we often talk about how Canada is very strong when it comes to early stage research and to clinical trials. Actually, that's one of our bench strengths, as you noted. And yet we often identify that there's a gap when it comes to then commercializing those technologies here. But we've seen models be really successful in other sectors like automotive. And Simon, I know you speak quite openly about this. Obviously, the Volkswagen deal is a recent development, $7 billion in St. Thomas, Ontario. And you talk about anchor companies as a model. And it's interesting, Volkswagen invested in Canada for many of the same reasons. It wasn't just about flow of capital. It was about, there was an ecosystem here. There was innovation, to your point, Courtney. So is there a model there in life sciences? Are we looking at life sciences similarly, building anchor companies, building ecosystems?
Well, I definitely think there are different facets of, there's maybe more than one model, I guess I would say. And for a country like Canada, it might be a kind of, multiplicity of approaches that might work. This is an area where, it probably stretches the limits of my expertise, but I would say as a general rule, there's a lot of evidence that, having large anchor companies can be good for innovation because, they can basically provide a source of talent and capital, to kind of, in a way, play kind of an incubation role.
Yes. Yeah.
We don't really have, a lot of large anchor companies in certain spaces. Life sciences would be one of them. The depth of our capital markets, can be an issue sometimes. Like, it's just a lot easier sometimes, in the United States, for example, to raise large amounts of VC money, to kind of, clinical trials are very expensive. So, that has been not just in, I have to say, in life sciences, but in other technology areas that, the kind of, our capital market structure and the availability of, say, venture capital can be an issue. So I think there can be, and frankly, the depth of the cluster. If you think about mining, for example, I mean, Canada is one of the world's leading issuers, in the mining sector. Or, if you go to Toronto, you have this deep expertise, all these, law firms that all know about this, and you have a lot of mining companies headquartered here. And so you've got this kind of cluster effect that actually, if you want to talk to people who know anything about mining, you could do a lot worse than being in this city. We don't necessarily have the kind of deep clusters you might have in Boston and a few other places in biomanufacturing. We're getting that in Toronto, I think, and in some, have some of that in Montreal. So, and certainly in Vancouver, for example, you've got clusters of expertise, particularly in some of these, advanced technologies in life sciences. But, for a policy wonk like me, we'd say, well, it isn't like, okay, if we just had this model, everything would be good. There's, availability of capital. Do you have strong clusters? Do you have anchor firms that can provide that kind of support? There's the issue of government support. Is there, regulatory, and is the regulatory environment, what kind of clinical trial infrastructure is available? I mean, everybody here will know, but actually getting a therapeutic from kind of the bench or, the great idea in somebody's head all the way into something that's in the marketplace can be $1 billion proposition. You need an awful lot of money. You need to have the right kind of regulatory framework. You might need the right kind of clinical trials infrastructure. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to come together. Part of what the life science strategy is that we're working on is to try to, is actually to try to make meaningful progress in all of those pillars. There's a skills pillar. There's a kind of government investment pillar. There's a regulatory pillar. So, we have a lot of work left to do, but it is an ecosystem, and some countries are really great in some parts of the ecosystem and not so great in others. And, what we want to try to do is strengthen the various pieces of the ecosystem so that the whole package actually results in the kind of environment you need to get investment.
I think one area that could help improve the Canadian ecosystem, kind of where it's lacking, is we do a world-class academic research here. World-class, top-notch. We're not so good at commercializing that science, and it's hard for young companies or an academic to try to really drive that new discovery, into a fundable company. And one thing that's lacking here is private capital or non-dilutive capital for private companies via like the SBIR program in the U.S. So that's a huge catalyst to innovation in the U.S. So I believe the government's working on a program like that. Is there any comments you can put on that, Simon?
I guess what I would say would be we're aware of this problem. I don't want to sound like cute or whatever, but the issue, particularly for pre-revenue companies and so on, to get capital there that is not dilutive is an issue. There's been a lot of work done in this space in recent years. We have the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative, which I think a lot of people in the VC sector, I don't want to speak for them, but certainly we hear from the VC community that has been a huge sea change in the maturity of the venture capital industry in Canada. And basically we have not the royal we, but the ministry, the government has gone in there and they've basically, kind of put a structure in place in which it's actually profitable for a lot of VC money to come in because the government, takes first loss or whatever. And we've actually used that program to incentivize more GPs to kind of set up in Canada because we also not just want to, get greater depth in the capital market, we actually want to get more expertise here. And I think people have generally judged that that's been successful. I don't want to, knock my own organization, but I think one of the things we probably do agree with is that there are areas, even though we've improved the overall environment for funding, that are probably weaker. Medical devices is one for sure. Hear that a lot. The investment community just in Canada doesn't get it, medical devices. And I think that there's more we can do for funding in the life sciences generally. So yeah, I would agree with the general proposition, and there's various instruments we put in place, but probably not something very large and bespoke in this area.
Yeah. And I agree, you've done great things, like Vicky's a great program in driving money into the venture industry. It's just, there's this one gap that, it's hard to raise money, it's hard to push this innovation forward, and it would actually help the venture community as well. It de-risk the technology and enable them to get better returns.
And no excuses on our part, but the $1 billion that the government put into the Strategic Innovation Fund last year or the year before, the money that went in through the medical countermeasures stream, I mean, my hope will be that this is a kind of permanent business line, but there's been a lot of money put in through the government's SIF, and even IRAP had received additional money, and the objective of a lot of that is actually to help particularly promising companies with great tech, kind of get off the ground and be successful. There has been some money as well put into clinical trials as well, specifically to support the biomanufacturing and life science strategy. That's now just starting to roll out, but I completely agree on the access to capital issue.
So one of the spaces where this really shows up in downtown Toronto, to talk about one of those clusters that you mentioned, Simon, is at JLabs. We were there last night for dinner, and I know you're at JLabs as well, Dom. Mm-hmm. They have this kind of mantra, or at least they said it at dinner, that it's all about the people. And they've really built this community at JLabs that is about the humans. And so I want to shift the conversation there as we close off of how do we retain our talent? Because we hear constantly that Canada punches above its weight on science. That's kind of well known even globally. I know the Stem Cell Network did a global survey and found that Canadian scientists rank top in the world. This is replicated over and over. But on the commercialization point, I think we've all talked about it this afternoon. There's a gap, and we do still see talent flowing elsewhere. So are there other models from other countries that we might borrow from or learn from in terms of talent retention, or what are we doing here?
Yeah, I would say, especially when I look at some of the advanced manufacturing hubs that exist around the globe, and in particular in support of life sciences, Ireland's of the world, Israel. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different places. Puerto Rico, as an example, you literally just go through the island and you see plant after plant, company after company in hubs where, again, there has been specific and strategic investment in the institutions that Simon has mentioned that either are being put in place, are in place, or you're thinking about here in Canada. Those institutions are finely honed in those countries. I've been out of my role as the head of global supply chain for 6 years now. I get at least 4 or 5 emails right now, probably every 2 to 3 months, from Ireland inviting me to some event, where they've got activities focused on workforce for the future, how they're educating and developing and training for the next wave of technology. They've looked at our pipelines, so they've looked out 12, 15 years across our industry, and they see what technologies are being developed. They've looked at labs and see the type of products like Dominic's working on, and they have specifically worked with academia to make sure that they have the workforce that's trained to be able to support our changing and evolving technology that we're putting into our plants of the future. And so there, when you have that level of integration with academia, government, industry, talking on an ongoing basis around what's needed, not just today, but more importantly, what's needed in the future, and they've put institutions in place to ensure that, that's a huge advantage.
And we've seen some announcements of collaboration between different sectors in Canada as well. We've seen Moderna, Accelera, many different announcements coming out. And I think, to your point, Simon, we're seeing this impetus now for continued investment that sort of atrophied in a state of relative calm around health security in terms of pandemic terms. We are at time, but I want to give you each one sentence, which is, if you were to leave this audience with one takeaway around what Canada can do to bolster its health security, what would that be?
So one sentence: build on your strength in the free flow of trade. Number two, work on the workforce of the future and the comments I just mentioned. And lastly, make life sciences one of your top priorities that transcends administrations. Because right now, during this administration, we feel very good, right? We've talked about a lot of things. You go to other administrations, and you can go from Prince to the Frog overnight. So I think it needs to be a foundational commitment for Canada over time.
Simon.
I agree completely. Wash your hands before every meal. I agree completely with Courtney. I would say one of the things that I think we need to do in Canada that I think the United States actually, and BARDA in particular, does well, and it's interesting, my staff have been talking to me a little bit about this, but I think there are very good connections, it's sort of at a distance, but between government, industry, and the scientific community, and there's a community of people who talk about these issues readily, and there's kind of a culture of getting people in a room and having those discussions. And I don't think, I think actually PPF and the Business Council and others, I think there is definitely, and we're very interested in that too, to get that going. But I think, I would say we need to deepen the conversations and the relationships among the people who are interested in this space because, frankly, a lot of that connective tissue has kind of dissolved over the last number of decades and has to be rebuilt. And I that may sound a little Pollyanna or sort of I'm just, but I'll give you an example. Canada has, we have a big automotive industry and we have a lot of expertise in automotive manufacturing. I have a division of the organization that knows every square inch of every factory floor of every automaker and every auto parts company in the country, basically, and have relationships with all the management teams and sit in on the analyst call and are on a first name basis with the people who run the automotive sector. So, we're interested in that industry and its success in Canada, and they know government and they kind of know where we're coming from, and there's a regular dialogue. It doesn't mean we always agree on everything, but it's we actually, the country has kind of, those relationships are there. And I'm not saying that they're not there at all in the life sciences. I had great relationships at Health Canada as the regulator, but from a kind of industrial development point of view and a kind of capability point of view, I think there's a lot more we could do to sort of figure out how we all talk to each other and relate to each other. I think that's going to be part of the kind of forward game plan. So please return my phone calls when we come calling. Thanks.
Comes back to the rebuilding trust point that was raised at the beginning. Dom, final word.
No, I think Simon's thoughts are great. So I think we need to communicate and kind of chart everything out and see where the world's going because we don't know where the next pandemic threat's going to come from. So, we have to invest in innovative technology to help us prepare for whatever it may be, if it's fungal, if it's bacteria, if it's another virus, if it's a retrovirus. And it takes a long time. So we have to be patient, invest, and communicate with each other.
Thank you. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you for your insights and your leadership.